Walking through the streets of London in the summer of 1945, you would have witnessed an extraordinary scene. Flags hung from every window, church bells rang out across the city, and crowds packed into Trafalgar Square, waving Union Jacks until their voices gave out from cheering. The war was over. Germany was defeated. Britain stood victorious in the greatest conflict humanity had ever seen.
But beneath all that celebration, beneath the confetti and the jubilation, there was something nobody wanted to talk about. The treasury was empty. Britain had won on the battlefield, but the balance sheet told a very different story. The bombs had stopped falling, but the bills were just beginning to arrive.
Understanding how the British Empire truly came to an end requires looking beyond the maps and military campaigns. We need to examine the ledger. History teaches us that empires die in battle, that they collapse when barbarians storm the gates or when colonies rise up in armed rebellion. But the British Empire didn't die by the sword. It died by the spreadsheet.
It was dismantled not by revolutionaries, but by accountants in Washington and bankers in New York who understood one simple, terrifying truth: whoever holds the debt owns the debtor.
Before the war, Britain was the undisputed financial center of the world. London stood as the heart of global finance. The sterling area created a vast economic ecosystem covering a quarter of the globe. From Australia to India, from Egypt to South Africa, international trade was conducted in British pounds. Money flowed into London from every corner of the empire and was redistributed like blood through an imperial body. This financial dominance allowed Britain to punch well above its weight, funding a massive navy, projecting power into the Middle East and Asia, and running trade deficits because the world always needed pounds.
But the war changed everything. Fighting the Nazi war machine required Britain to spend money it didn't have at a speed never before seen in human history. Factories ran continuously day and night. Ships were built, destroyed, and built again. Entire cities were bombed and rebuilt while fighting continued. The empire was mobilized not for profit, but for survival, and survival proved devastatingly expensive. By 1945, Britain owed more money than at any point in its entire history.
This wasn't abstract debt. It was real and crushing.
Britain had sold off foreign assets to pay for weapons, liquidating investments in American railways and Argentine farms that had taken generations to build. They stripped gold from the Bank of England vaults and shipped it across the Atlantic. But the most shocking financial maneuver wasn't the borrowing from America, it was borrowing from the empire itself. This chapter is often omitted from textbooks. It's known as the sterling balances.
To fight the war in Asia and North Africa, Britain needed supplies, uniforms, food, ammunition, and raw materials. A huge portion came from India. But Britain couldn't pay India for these goods, so they devised a system that was effectively a massive forced loan. When British commanders in India bought supplies, they didn't pay producers in gold or dollars. They paid in rupees, printed by the colonial government in Delhi. In exchange, the British government deposited IOUs in London bank accounts.
On paper, India appeared to be getting rich. The balance in London grew to over £1.3 billion, equivalent to roughly $45 billion in today's money. But in reality, India was being robbed. The rupees flooding the Indian economy caused massive inflation. This inflation directly caused the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed millions.
Britain was essentially fighting the war on a credit card issued in the name of its starving subjects.
But the biggest creditor wasn't India, it was the United States. The relationship between Britain and America during the war was presented as a partnership of equals, two great democracies standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. But beneath the speeches and photo opportunities, the balance of power had shifted permanently. America was the lender, Britain was the borrower, and borrowers don't write the rules.
At the war's beginning, Britain paid America for weapons under a system called cash and carry, literally handing over gold and cash for every rifle and tank. When the cash ran out, Britain turned to Roosevelt with a simple problem. Without American support, Britain would lose the war. Roosevelt offered help, but it wasn't free. The solution was called Lend-Lease. On the surface, it sounded generous. America would lend Britain weapons, food, oil, and raw materials for the war's duration.
But the Americans inserted clauses designed to break the British Empire's economic monopoly. They demanded that Britain dismantle the system of imperial preference, the trade system favoring goods from the empire. This was the economic glue holding the empire together. America wanted access to the markets of India, Africa, and Australia.
Throughout the war, British economist John Maynard Keynes fought a desperate battle against American planners like Harry Dexter White. This came to a head at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Bretton Woods is famous for creating the IMF and the World Bank, but the real story is the defeat of Britain. Keynes arrived with a plan to save the British economy, proposing a new global currency called the Bancor. It was brilliant and would have allowed Britain to recover gracefully.
Harry Dexter White crushed it. He knew America held all the cards. He insisted on a system built around the US dollar and gold. Britain had no choice but to sign their own warrant of execution as a global power.
Then came the shock. When the war ended in 1945, Britain assumed Lend-Lease would continue to allow recovery. The country was exhausted. Rationing was stricter after the war than during it. But the moment Japan surrendered in August 1945, President Truman turned off the tap abruptly without warning. Ships already at sea carrying wheat and oil to Britain were ordered to turn around unless Britain could pay in cash. Britain had no cash, no dollars. Its gold was gone, its industry exhausted.
Britain had won the war and lost the peace in a single afternoon. With no choice left, the British government sent a delegation to Washington led by Keynes. They weren't there to negotiate as equals. They were there to beg. Keynes hoped for a grant in recognition of Britain's sacrifice. The Americans said no. There would be no gift, only a loan with strings so tight they would strangle the British economy for decades.
In 1946, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, borrowing $3.75 billion. The conditions were lethal. First, Britain had to pay interest, which shocked the British public. Second, Britain had to dismantle the sterling area. The Americans demanded that sterling become convertible, meaning anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for US dollars. This was a trap. America knew everyone wanted dollars to buy American goods.
Nobody wanted pounds because British industry was destroyed. Keynes warned against it, but the Americans were adamant. Britain signed because they had to eat.
The crisis arrived exactly as predicted. In 1947, Britain made sterling convertible. The result was a financial massacre. Within weeks, countries rushed to dump pounds and buy dollars. Britain's reserves drained at terrifying speed. It was a run on the bank, but the bank was the United Kingdom. Convertibility was suspended after only 5 weeks, but the damage was done. Confidence in sterling was shattered. From that moment on, Britain was no longer a global financial authority.
It was a client state. Every policy decision was constrained by the need to defend the currency. The empire itself was becoming too expensive to hold. The colonies were no longer assets, but liabilities.
India was the first to go. Britain owed India billions and couldn't pay, couldn't afford to govern. In 1947, Britain left India not after careful planning, but in haste. The result was partition, violence, and chaos. Britain didn't leave as a confident imperial power. It left as a bankrupt landlord fleeing a building it could no longer maintain. Other colonies followed. Palestine was abandoned. Burma was let go. Across Africa and Asia, the same pattern repeated.
Britain didn't fight to keep the empire because it couldn't afford the overhead.
By 1949, the British government was forced to devalue the pound. Overnight, the value of money in every British person's pocket dropped by 30% against the dollar. It was a public admission of failure. The 1940s ended with Britain victorious, but broken.
The 1950s were supposed to be the era of recovery, but the political class refused to accept their diminished status. This delusion crashed into reality in 1956 at the Suez Canal. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the canal, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden conspired with France and Israel to launch a secret invasion. Militarily, the operation was successful, but the battle wasn't decided on the sands of Egypt. It was decided in Washington.
President Eisenhower was furious. He didn't send the U.S. Navy to stop the British fleet. He used a weapon far more powerful. He attacked the pound. The United States Treasury began selling British pounds on currency markets. Sterling plummeted. Britain needed emergency IMF funds, but Eisenhower blocked the request. He told Britain bluntly that if they didn't withdraw, he would crash the British economy. Britain was days from national bankruptcy. Eden had no choice. He ordered withdrawal.
Suez was the moment the illusion died. The world saw that Britain could no longer act independently. Its military power was useless because it was funded by American credit.
The 1960s saw continued economic decline. By the mid-60s, the pound's fixed rate was too high. Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson fought a 3-year battle to save the pound, sacrificing everything. But in November 1967, he was forced to devalue from $2.80 to $2.40. That evening, he appeared on television and said the pound in people's pockets hadn't been devalued. It was a lie. Britain imported half its food. Prices rose immediately.
The British people realized their leaders weren't just powerless, but dishonest about it. The 1970s brought the final reckoning. The oil shock of 1973 hit hard. Inflation soared to 25%. Strikes paralyzed the country. Britain was called the sick man of Europe. By 1976, the markets stopped lending. The pound went into free fall. In September 1976, Chancellor Denis Healey had to apply to the IMF for a bailout. This was humiliation without precedent. The IMF was for developing nations, not for the United Kingdom, victor of World War II.
A team of IMF inspectors arrived in London and dictated terms. They demanded massive spending cuts. Britain took the loan of $3.9 billion, the largest in IMF history. The 1976 crisis was the absolute nadir. Britain finally accepted it was just a normal country.
But from this disaster, a new Britain emerged. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power. She understood that land was no longer the source of wealth, capital was. In 1986, her government deregulated London's financial markets, inviting banks from around the world. They transformed London from the capital of a British empire into the capital of a global financial empire. Britain created a network of tax havens in territories like the Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands.
If it couldn't rule the world with battleships, it could rule it with bank accounts.
The story ends with strange irony. The United States stripped Britain of its colonies, industry, and currency status. But Britain adapted, becoming the service provider to the American global order, the banker for American-created globalization. The British people paid a terrible price with their savings, empire, and decades of austerity. They fought a war they couldn't afford to save a world that would no longer belong to them.
Today, Britain is wealthy again, but differently. It's the wealth of the middleman, not of empire. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a loan agreement, a devalued currency, a fax from the IMF. The lesson is clear. You can have the strongest military and the most righteous cause, but if you run out of money, you lose. The ledger always wins.
If you found this revealing, subscribe so you never miss stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about how the world really works.